up, everybody? I'm Jason Kishinev. Welcome back to A People's Historian, where we read about 30 minutes out of a history book every episode. We're reading A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, and we're in Chapter 21, Carter, Reagan, Bush, the Bipartisan Consensus. Shall we dig in? Carter approved tax reforms which benefited mainly the corporations. Economist Robert Lakachman, writing in The Nation, noted the sharp increase in corporate profits, 44%, in the last quarter of 1978 over the previous year's last quarter. He wrote, "Perhaps the president's most outrageous act occurred last November when he signed into law an $18 billion tax reduction, the bulk of whose benefits accrue to affluent individuals and corporations. In 1979, while the poor were taking cuts, the salary of the chairman of Exxon Oil was being raised to $830,000 a year, and that of the chairman of Mobil Oil to over $1 million a year. That year, while Exxon's net income rose 56% to more than $4 billion, 3,000 small independent gasoline stations went out of business. Carter made some efforts to hold on to social programs, but this was undermined by his very large military budgets. Presumably this was to guard against the Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, Carter could take only symbolic actions, like reinstituting the draft or calling for a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. On the other hand, American weaponry was used to support dictatorial regimes battling left-wing rebels abroad. A report by the Carter administration to Congress in 1977 was blunt, saying that a number of countries with deplorable records of human rights observance are also countries where we have important security and foreign policy interests. Money. Thus, Carter asked Congress in the spring of 1980 for $5.7 million in credits. That's million with an M. Doesn't seem like that much money for government. It's a lot of money for me. Carter asked Congress in the spring of 1980 for $5.7 million in credits for the military junta fighting off a peasant rebellion in El Salvador. In the Philippines, after the 1978 National Assembly elections, President Ferdinand Marcos imprisoned 10 of the 21 losing opposition candidates. Many prisoners were tortured. Many civilians were killed. Still, Carter urged Congress to give Marcos $300 million in military aid for the next 5 years. In Nicaragua, the United States had helped maintain the Somoza dictatorship for decades. Misreading the basic weakness of that regime and the popularity of the revolution against it, the Carter administration continued its support for Somoza until close to the regime's fall in 1979. In Iran, toward the end of 1978, the long years of resentment against the Shah's dictatorship culminated in mass demonstrations. On September 8, 1978, hundreds of demonstrators were massacred by the Shah's troops. The next day, according to a UPI dispatch from Tehran, Carter affirmed his support for the Shah. This is the dispatch I'm quoting, the UPI dispatch. Troops opened fire on demonstrators against the Shah for the third straight day yesterday, and President Jimmy Carter telephoned the Royal Palace to express support for Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who faced the worst crisis of his 37-year reign. 9 members of parliament walked out on a speech by Iran's new premier, shouting that his hands were stained with blood in the crackdown on conservative Muslims and other protesters. On December 13, 1978, Nicholas Gage reported for the New York Times, "The staff of the United States Embassy here has been bolstered by dozens of specialists flown in to back an effort to help the Shah against a growing challenge to his rule, according to embassy sources. The new arrivals, according to the embassy sources, included a number of Central Intelligence Agency specialists on Iran, in addition to diplomats and military personnel. CIA agents are always a very stabilizing force. In early 1979, as the crisis in Iran was intensifying, the former chief analyst on Iran for the CIA told New York Times reporter Seymour Hersh that he and his colleagues knew of the tortures of Iran dissenters by Savak, the Iranian secret police set up during the late 1950s by the Shah with help from the CIA. Furthermore, he told Hersh that a senior CIA official was involved in instructing officials in Savak on torture techniques. It was a popular, massive revolution, and the Shah fled. The Carter administration later accepted him into the country, presumably for medical treatment, and the anti-American feelings of the revolutionaries reached a high point. Remember, we'd been interfering in Iranian politics over oil since the 1950s, possibly even sooner. On November 4th, 1979, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was taken over by student militants who, demanding that the Shah be returned to Iran for punishment, held 52 embassy employees hostage. For the next 14 months, with the hostages still held in the embassy compound, that issue took the forefront of foreign news in the United States and aroused powerful nationalist feelings. I was only like 9 or 10, but even I can remember it. When Carter ordered the Immigration and Naturalization Service to start deportation proceedings against Iranian students who lacked valid visas, the New York Times gave cautious but clear approval. Politicians and the press played into a general hysteria. An Iranian American girl who was slated to give a high school commencement address was removed from the program. The bumper sticker, "Bomb Iran," appeared on autos all over the country. It was a rare journalist bold enough to point out, as Alan Richmond of the Boston Globe did when the 52 hostages were released alive and apparently well, that there was a certain lack of proportion in American reactions to this and other violations of human rights. There were 52 of them, a number easy to comprehend. It wasn't like 15,000 innocent people permanently disappearing in Argentina. They, the American hostages, spoke our language. There were 3,000 people summarily shot in Guatemala last year who did not. The hostages were still in captivity when Jimmy Carter faced Ronald Reagan in the election of 1980. That fact and the economic distress felt by many were largely responsible for Carter's defeat. Reagan's victory, followed 8 years later by the election of George Bush, meant that another part of the establishment, lacking even the faint liberalism of the Carter presidency, would be in charge. The policies would be more crass, cutting benefits to poor people, lowering taxes for the wealthy, increasing the military budget, filling the federal court system with conservative judges, actively working to destroy revolutionary movements in the Caribbean. The dozen years of the Reagan-Bush presidency transformed the federal judiciary, never more than moderately liberal, into a predominantly conservative institution. By the fall of 1991, Reagan and Bush had filled more than half of the 837 federal judgeships and appointed enough right-wing justices to transform the Supreme Court. In the 70s, with liberal justices William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall in the lead, the court had declared death penalties unconstitutional, had supported in Roe v. Wade the right of women to choose abortions, and had interpreted the civil rights law as permitting special attention to blacks and women to make up for past discriminations. Affirmative action. William Rehnquist, first named to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon, was made Chief Justice by Ronald Reagan. In the Reagan-Bush years, the Rehnquist court made a series of decisions that weakened Roe v. Wade, brought back the death penalty, reduced the rights of detainees against police powers, prevented doctors in federally supported family planning clinics from giving women information on abortions, and said that poor people could be forced to pay for public education. Education was not a fundamental right. Justices William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall were the last of the court's liberals. Old and ill, though reluctant to give up the fight, they retired. The final act to create a conservative Supreme Court was President Bush's nomination to replace Marshall. He chose a black conservative, Clarence Thomas. Despite dramatic testimony from a former colleague, a young black law professor named Anita Hill, that Thomas had sexually harassed her, Thomas was approved by the Senate, and now the Supreme Court moved even more decisively to the right. With conservative federal judges with pro-business appointments to the National Labor Relations Board, judicial decisions and board findings weakened a labor movement already troubled by a decline in manufacturing. Workers who went out on strike found themselves with no legal protection. One of the first acts of the Reagan administration was to dismiss from their jobs en masse striking air traffic controllers. And he didn't really cover this in here, but he also tried to bust the union of the California farm workers with Cesar Chavez as governor. It was a warning to future strikers and a sign of the weakness of the labor movement, which in the 30s and 40s had been a powerful force. Corporate America became the greatest beneficiary of the Reagan-Bush years. In the 60s and the 70s, an important environmental movement had grown in the nation. Horrified at the poisoning of the air, the seas, and the rivers, and the deaths of thousands each year as a result of work conditions, after a mine explosion in West Virginia killed 78 miners in November 1968, there had been angry protest in the mine district, and Congress passed the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969. Nixon's Secretary of Labor spoke of a new national passion for environmental improvement. The following year, yielding to strong demands from the labor movement and consumer groups, but also seeing it as an opportunity to win the support of working class voters, President Nixon had signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, also known as OSHA. This was an important piece of legislation establishing a universal right to a safe and healthy workplace and creating an enforcement machinery. Reflecting on this, years later, Herbert Stein, who had been the chairman of Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors, lamented that the juggernaut of environmental regulation proved not to be controllable by the Nixon administration. While President Jimmy Carter came into office praising the OSHA program, he was also eager to please the business community. The woman he appointed to head OSHA, Eula Bingham, fought for strong enforcement of the act and was occasionally successful. But as the American economy showed signs of trouble with oil prices, inflation, and unemployment rising, Carter seemed more and more concerned about the difficulties the act created for business. He became an advocate of removing regulations on corporations and giving them more leeway, even if this was hurtful to labor and to consumers. environmental regulation became more and more a victim of cost-benefit analysis, in which regulations protecting the health and safety of the public became secondary to how costly this would be for business. Under Reagan and Bush, this concern for the economy, which was a shorthand term for corporate profit, dominated any concern for workers or consumers. President Reagan proposed to replace tough enforcements of environmental laws by a voluntary approach. Leaving it to businesses to decide for themselves what they would do. Well, if you would like to not pollute, you can go ahead and not pollute. I can't do Carter, but I can do Reagan. Maybe not well, but I can do Reagan. He appointed as head of OSHA a businessman who was hostile to OSHA's aims. One of his first acts was to order the destruction of 100,000 government booklets pointing out the dangers of cotton dust to textile workers. Right, we shouldn't know the dangers. Political scientist William Grover, evaluating environmental policy under Carter and Reagan as part of his penetrating structural critique of both presidents, concluded OSHA appears caught in a cycle of liberal presidents who want to retain some health and safety regulatory programs, but who also need economic growth for political survival, and conservative presidents who focus almost exclusively on the growth side of the equation. Such a cycle will always tend to subordinate the need for safe and healthful workplaces to ensure that commitment to OSHA will only be as strong as the priorities of business will allow. George Bush presented himself as the environmental president and pointed with pride to his signing of the Clean Air Act of 1990. But 2 years after that act was passed, it was seriously weakened by a new rule of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, that allowed manufacturers to increase by 245 tons a year hazardous pollutants in the atmosphere. Furthermore, little money was allocated for enforcement. Contaminated drinking water had caused over 100,000 illnesses between 1971 and 1985, according to an EPA report. But in Bush's first year in office, while the EPA received 80,000 complaints of contaminated drinking water, only 1 in 100 was investigated. And in 1991-1992, according to a private environmental group, the Natural Resources Defense Council, there were some 250,000 violations of the Safe Water Drinking Act, which had been passed during the Nixon administration. Shortly after Bush took office, a government scientist prepared testimony for a congressional committee on the dangerous effects of industrial uses of coal and other fossil fuels in contributing to global warming, a depletion of the Earth's protective ozone layer. The White House changed the testimony over the scientists' objections to minimize the danger. Again, business worries about regulations seem to override the safety of the public. The ecological crisis in the world had become so obviously serious that Pope John Paul II felt the need to rebuke the wealthy classes of the industrialized nations for creating that crisis. And I don't do the Pope well either. I'm not even going to try. Today, the dramatic threat of ecological breakdown is teaching us the extent to which greed and selfishness, both individual and collective, are contrary to the order of creation. At international conferences to deal with the perils of global warming, the European community and Japan proposed specific levels and timetables for carbon dioxide emissions, in which the United States was the leading culprit. But as the New York Times reported in the summer of 1991, the Bush administration fears that it would hurt the nation's economy in the short term for no demonstrable long-term climatic benefit. Scientific opinion was quite clear on the long-term benefit, but this was not as important as the economy. That is, the needs of corporations. Sound familiar? Evidence became stronger by the late 80s that renewable energy sources, water, wind, sunlight, can produce more usable energy than nuclear plants, which were dangerous and expensive, and produced radioactive wastes that could not be safely disposed of. Yet the Reagan and Bush administrations made deep cuts. Under Reagan, a 90% cut in research into renewable energy possibilities. In June 1992, more than 100 countries participated in the Earth Summit Environmental Conference in Brazil. Statistics showed that the armed forces of the world were responsible for 2/3 of the gases that depleted the ozone layer. But when it was suggested that the Earth Summit consider the effects of the military on environmental degradation, the United States delegation objected, and the suggestion was defeated. Indeed, the preservation of a huge military establishment and the retention of profit levels of oil corporations appeared to be twin objectives of the Reagan-Bush administrations. Shortly after Ronald Reagan took office, 23 oil industry executives contributed $270,000 to redecorate the White House living quarters. How thoughtful! According to the Associated Press, the solicitation drive came 4 weeks after the president decontrolled oil prices, a decision worth $2 billion to the oil industry. Jack Hodges of Oklahoma City, owner of Core Oil and Gas Company, said, "The top man of this country ought to live in one of the top places. Mr. Reagan has helped the energy business." While he built up the military, allocations of over $1 trillion in his first 4 years in office, Reagan tried to pay for this with cuts in benefits for the poor. There would be $140 billion of cuts in social programs through 1984 and an increase of $181 billion for defense in the same period. He also proposed tax cuts of $190 billion, billion with the B, most of this going to the wealthy. Despite the tax cuts and the military appropriations, Reagan insisted he would still balance the budget because the tax cuts would so stimulate the economy as to generate new revenue. Nobel Prize winning economist Wassily Leontief remarked dryly, "This is not likely to happen, and in fact, I personally guarantee that it will not happen." Indeed, Department of Commerce figures showed that periods of lowered corporate taxes, 1973 to 75, 1979 to 1982, did not at all show higher capital investment but a steep drop. The sharpest rise of capital investment, 1975 to 1979, took place when the corporate taxes were slightly higher than they had been the preceding 5 years. The human consequences of Reagan's budget cuts went deep. For instance, Social Security disability benefits were terminated for 350,000 people. A man injured in an oil field accident was forced to go back to work. The federal government overruling both the company doctor and the state supervisor who testified that he was too disabled to work. The man died, and federal officials said, "We have a PR problem." A war hero of Vietnam, Roy Benavides, who had been presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor by Reagan, was told by Social Security officials that the shrapnel pieces in his heart, arms, and leg did not prevent him from working. That is not funny. Sorry. Appearing before a congressional committee, he denounced Reagan. Thanks for the medal. Now go back to work. That is just terrible. Unemployment grew in the Reagan years. In the year 1982, 30 million people were unemployed all or part of the year. One result was that over 16 million Americans lost medical insurance, which was often tied to holding a job. In Michigan, where the employment rate was the highest in the country, the infant death rate began to rise in 1981. New requirements eliminated free school lunches for more than 1 million poor children who depended on the meal for as much as half of their daily nutrition. Millions of children entered the ranks of the officially declared poor, and soon a quarter of the nation's children, 12 million, were living in poverty. In parts of Detroit, 1/3 of the children were dying before their first birthday, and the New York Times commented, "Given what's happening to the hungry in America, this administration has cause only for shame." Welfare became an object of attack. Aid to single mothers with children through the AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. Food stamps, health care for the poor through Medicaid. For most people on welfare, the benefits differed from state to state. This meant $500 to $700 a month in aid, leaving them well below the poverty level of about $900 a month. Black children were 4 times as likely as white children to grow up on welfare. Early in the Reagan administration, responding to the argument that government aid was not needed, that private enterprise would take care of poverty, a mother wrote to her local newspaper, "I am on aid to families with dependent children, and both my children are in school. I have graduated from college with distinction, 128th in a class of over 1,000, with a BA in English and sociology. I have experience in library work, child care, social work, and counseling. I have been to the CETA office. They have nothing for me. I also go every week to the library to scour the newspaper help want ads. I have kept a copy of every cover letter that I have sent out with my resume. The stack is inches thick. I have applied for jobs paying as little as $8,000 a year. I work part-time in a library for $3.50 an hour. Welfare reduces my allotment to compensate. It appears we have employment offices that can't employ, governments that can't govern, and an economic system that can't produce jobs for people ready to work. Last week I sold my bed to pay for the insurance on my car, which in the absence of mass transportation, I need to go job hunting. I sleep on a piece of rubber foam somebody gave me. So this is the great American dream my parents came to this country for. Work hard, get a good education, follow the rules, and you will be rich. I don't want to be rich. I just want to be able to feed my children and live with some semblance of dignity." Holy cow, I'm going to cry. I'm going to end there. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do hit that like and subscribe button and the notification bell. YouTube, has been unknown to unsubscribe people. Keep on watching and keep on reading history. I think the camera angle's a little bit different. If you like it, put it in the comments. If you don't like it, put it in the comments. And we'll see you next time. Ciao.